All right, so we're going to be finishing up Mark chapter 14. So if you guys would turn to Mark 14. I got to say, I've really kind of enjoyed the challenge of Mark. It's just a little different than the other Gospels in a lot of ways. And so a lot of those unique challenges really kind of force you to dig deep. So, and that way, I've really enjoyed studying it out. So, if you guys would, we're going to start in verse 53. So, if you would stand with us as we read it. And then they led Jesus away to the high priest, and with him were assembled all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes. But Peter followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest, and he sat with the servants and warmed himself at the fire. Now the chief priests and all of the council sought testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but found none. For many bore false witness against him, but their testimonies did not agree. And then some rose up and bore false witness against him, saying, "We heard him say, 'I will destroy this temple made with hands. Within 3 days I will build another made without hands.' But even then did their testimonies agree. But not even then did their testimonies agree. And the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, saying, 'Do you answer nothing? What is it these men testify against you?' But he kept silent and answered nothing. Again the high priest asked, saying to him, 'Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?' Jesus said, 'I am. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven.' And then the high priest tore his clothes and said, 'What further need do we have of witnesses? For you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?' And they all condemned him to be deserving of death. And then some began to spit on him and blindfold him and to beat him and say to him, 'Prophesy.' And the officers struck him with the palms of their hands. Now Peter was below in the courtyard, and one of the servant girls of the high priest came, and when she saw Peter warming himself, she looked at him and said, 'You also were with Jesus of Nazareth.' But he denied it, saying, 'I neither know nor understand what you are saying.' And he went out onto the porch, and the rooster crowed. And the servant girl saw him again and began to say to those who stood by, 'This is one of them.' But he denied it again. And a little later, those who stood by said to Peter again, 'Surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean, and your speech shows it.' And then he began to curse and swear, 'I do not know this man of whom you speak.' A second time the rooster crowed, and Peter called to mind the words that Jesus had said to him, 'Before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times.' And then he thought about it, and he wept." All right, you guys can have a seat. So it's always kind of interesting picking up in the middle of a chapter again, but this has got some really interesting stuff here. This trial that they went through. A lot of times as you're reading through this, it looks like we're talking about one event, and it's not. It's actually multiple events. And so starting out in verse 53, it says, "Then they led Jesus away to the high priest, and with him assembled all the chief priests and elders and scribes." So this trial here was completely and totally illegal. This is not how it was to be done. These guys took advantage. Remember, we talked about when they came and captured him and took him by night, it was because Jesus had quite the following, and they realized that if they did this in the middle of the daytime, there would likely be an uprising. So we're going to read really quick here, Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 2 through 6. Actually, I don't think I have that one up on the verse, so if you guys would turn there, we'll read it together. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Chapter 17, verses 2 through 6. This is basically the law that gives them the direction for how to have a trial. It says, "If there is found among you within any of your gates which the Lord your God gives you, a man or a woman who has been wicked in the sight of the Lord your God, in transgressing his covenant, who has gone and served other gods and worshipped them, either the sun or the moon or any of the hosts of heaven, which I have not commanded, and it is told to you, and you hear of it, then you shall inquire diligently. And if it is indeed true and certain that such an abomination has been committed in Israel, then you shall bring out to your gates that man or woman who has committed that wicked thing, and you shall stone to death that man or that woman with stones. Whoever is deserving of death shall be put to death on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. He shall not be put to death on the testimony of 1 witness. Okay, so that's an important key part of this story. So, like I said earlier, it's important to realize that this trial before the Jewish leaders actually was 3 different trials. We need to differentiate between 2 guys here, and this has caused some confusion over the years because we have 2 guys that are called the high priest. We have Annas and we have Caiaphas. So we're going to kind of separate these guys and explain who they are. So Annas was appointed as the high priest by Rome, and he served as the high priest of Israel from 6 to 15 A.D. And he was, as happened many times in Rome, there were many regime changes locally, and so usually whenever a new governor would come in or a new leader, they would appoint people that they would trust. They didn't like carried overs from the last regime. So Annas was ousted in 15 A.D., but he was still considered by many Jews to be the unofficial high priest. Annas actually had 5 sons, and every single one of them at one time served as high priest. Caiaphas was actually his son-in-law, and he was officially recognized by Rome, the official high priest at the time of Jesus' death. And he served as a high priest from 18 to 36 A.D. So this really was kind of the first family of the Jewish religious leaders. These guys were always in power. So this first time we see Jesus he was brought to Annas' house. The second was before Caiaphas, and then the third was an early morning official hearing before the entire Sanhedrin. So it's good to keep those things separate. So in Mark, it doesn't really talk a whole lot about the trial at Annas' house, but we can read about it in John 18:19 through 24. It says, the high priest then asked Jesus about his disciples and his doctrine. And Jesus answered him, I spoke openly to the world. I always taught in synagogues and in the temple, where the Jews always met. And in secret I have said nothing. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. Indeed, you know what I said. And when they had said these things, one of the officers who stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, Do you answer the high priest like that? And Jesus answered him, If I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. But if well, why do you strike me? And then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. So this interrogation was very unproductive. Jesus wasn't having any of it. And so, we pick up in Mark basically the details from the second trial. So in back in Mark, verse 54, it says, But Peter followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest, and he sat with the servants and warmed himself by the fire. So what we're going to do is we're going to leave Peter here by the fire, and we're going to come back to him towards the end of the study. And I want to point out here that there are some different accounts of Peter's denial. And there's a danger to look at this portion of the story as kind of a concrete, linear thing that's going on. This is more like a divergence of 2 paths. We're going to leave Peter at the fire, and we're going to follow what happens to Jesus. And then after that, we're going to come back to Peter, and he's going to tell his story about what happens while Jesus is having his trial. So we're going to leave Peter there. And in verses 55 through 56 says, "Now the chief priest for all the council sought testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but found none, for many bore false witness against him, but their testimonies did not agree." So this had to be really frustrating for the Jewish leaders because they couldn't even fabricate a cohesive argument against Jesus. And they knew their law. According to Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 6, "Whoever is deserving of death shall be put to death at the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses." And they couldn't get that right. "He shall not be put to death at the testimony of just 1 witness." So they couldn't even get their lies straight. So then in 57 through 59, it says, "Then some rose up and bore false witness against him, saying, 'We heard him say, I will destroy this temple made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands.' But not even then did their testimonies agree." So we kind of look back at it, investigating it. Is this actually something that Jesus said? And we actually find that it was. So back in John chapter 2, we read where Jesus made a whip of cords and he cleansed the temple. This is the first temple cleansing that he went with. The religious leaders were all ticked off. And Jesus says, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of merchandise." And so we pick it up in John chapter 2, 18 through 22. We have the response of the Jewish leaders to Jesus. "So the Jews answered and said to him, 'What sign do you show us since you do these things?' And Jesus answered and said to them, 'Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up.' And then the Jews said, 'It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days?' But he was speaking of the temple of his body. Therefore, when he had risen from the dead, his disciples remembered that, and he said this to them. And they believed the scripture and the word which Jesus had said." So it's important to note that this actually took place 3 years before this trial happened. About approximately 3 years. Jesus' first temple cleansing was at the beginning of his ministry. A lot of people will look at the different accounts of Scripture and say, well, some say that it happened at the beginning, some it happened at the end, but they fail to realize that there was actually 2 individual times that he went and did this. These guys are quoting what Jesus said from the first temple cleansing. So it's kind of interesting that they remembered pretty much at least the gist of what he had said 3 years prior. You know that these guys had spies running around basically jotting down or chiseling down on a tablet, I guess, everything that Jesus had said, when he's doing his teaching, trying to find something that they could hold against him. And this is the best that they could have. So the religious leaders of the time, of course, Jesus' answer to them didn't satisfy them because they were all crooked, and they held a grudge. Now, when you start reading the historian Josephus, he mentions several times something called the Bazaars of Annas. And basically what that was is Annas and his 5 sons ran all of those, sacrificial animal marts. The sheep mart, the cattle mart, where you had pre-approved sacrifices. So, these guys really did make a monopoly on the religious law. And so, obviously when Jesus comes and overturns the tables and kicks all these guys out, these guys are pretty upset because it cost them. And he challenged them openly. So, it's said that, the most effective lie is half true. And that's what these guys were getting at. Yeah, Jesus basically said those words, but that's not what he was talking about. And they couldn't get their stories to match. In verse 60 through 61, it says, "The high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, saying, 'Do you answer nothing? What is it these men testify against you?' But he kept silent and answered nothing. Again, the high priest asked him, saying to him, 'Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?'" So this is kind of an act of desperation. Everything else that they've tried has not worked. All these witnesses that they have found or coached to bear witness against Jesus. It has not worked. So the high priest stands up, enters into the midst of this of the gathering, and tries to provoke Jesus. The witnesses didn't stand up under questioning, and so now he's going to take it into his own hands. Now Jesus didn't answer at first. There's a great quote from Napoleon Bonaparte that says, "Never interrupt your enemy when he's making a mistake." And as these guys are throwing accusations at Jesus, there's no reason for him to even answer, because nothing that they're saying is sticking to him. Anything that he answers could potentially be used against him. Jesus has no reason to defend himself because the evidence wasn't anything that could convict him until the very, very last question. The answer to this question would set up the events in motion that would lead to his death. So as Jesus thought about what he was going to say and what was going to quickly happen to him after he said it, you have to imagine him, okay, here's the answer. And he says in verse 62, Jesus says, "I am, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." Jesus doesn't stop with, "Yeah, I'm the guy." Jesus goes on to tell them that he is the one that is going to be judging them, sitting at the right hand of power. Of course, they totally understood exactly what he was saying. When he said that he will be sitting at the right hand of power, that meant that he was going to judge them. And this had to be an absolute slap in the face of the priests, because he and his family were above the law, or so they thought. They were the judges, not the judged. And how dare this mere country rabbi bring accusations against them? These guys had defrauded the people, abused the office of priest, and conspired to commit murder. These people really thought that they were untouchable. And Jesus was saying that, not only are you going to be judged, but it's going to be me who does it. And this had to put the priests over the top. And it's really interesting when you kind of look at how Jesus is dealing with these guys. And you look at other places in Scripture that talk about how, God looks at us. I've spent a lot of time in court in my previous job. And, it becomes, it's fascinating. We have so many shows on TV that deal with courtroom dramas. But, 90% of court is way less than drama. It is the most boring thing that you could ever be subject to. But there is a method, and there is a way that things work. And there's one person in that court hearing that is responsible for recording every word that is spoken. That is the court reporter. And if you ever, they're always over there by the judge, and they're standing and looking back and forth, and they've got a really special machine that actually they type on to keep this stuff. But that's their job, is to record every word that is said so that it can be referred to later on in the court. And it has been the undoing of many people when they have basically testified against themselves. So this court was illegal from man's perspective, and it's going to be used against them. There is incriminating testimony that will be used against them at the judgment, as will every word they uttered and every thought that they had. Now, this is true for us. The judgment is no joke. It would always drive me crazy sitting in a courtroom and somebody would have evidence that was absolutely legitimate, but it was some minor problem with it, so that it was not admissible. And a lot of the stuff was key evidence that would either, convict a person, or it would be inadmissible, so the person would get off for whatever they did. Super frustrating knowing that there is proof and not being able to use it because of some kind of legal finagling by attorneys and the law as it is interpreted. But God has a law too. And it's quite a bit different. It's actually a lot more simple. And there is a court reporter that takes down everything you say. And not only does he take down everything you say, he takes down everything you think. Now that's scary. There's no way for any Weasley attorney to argue against the evidence presented at your trial for the things that you've thought. God basically has a legal wiretap on your brain. Let that sink in for a minute. How many times in your life, especially when you're, maybe arguing with your parents about something and your own words incriminate you? It's like I'm in the middle of this really, really brilliant argument about why it really wasn't me that did this thing, but then, I'm reminded of something I said earlier that contradicts this, and my whole argument falls apart, and I have to own it. I really hated that. It drove me nuts. But how in the world can you defend against the thoughts that are in your head? You might ask yourself, how can I be responsible for that? Well, it's your head, not anybody else's. It's the ultimate responsibility. I think most of us would agree that we're super frustrated by people not taking responsibility and blaming everything else on other people that they should absolutely be responsible for. And so then we shy away from the things that we allow ourselves to think and the things that we allow the places that we allow our minds to linger. Your thoughts are conceived in your heart, and even if they never come out of your mouth, they still condemn you. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5, 27 through 28, you have heard it said that said of those of old, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that whoever looks at a woman and lusts for her has already committed adultery with her in her heart. This is not a warning to just men, okay? It has a much broader interpretation. Let's just say every negative thought or every sinful urge you're accountable for before the Lord. This was a challenge to all those who thought all you had to do was be good outwardly. Follow the law outwardly. It made you good enough for God. As it opens our eyes, I think, to the hopelessness of our situation. We face trying to be good, and we just, a lot of times we beat ourselves up over our failures. But it doesn't surprise God. And so if we let ourselves just wallow in that failure, that's not what his wish is for us. This is actually a case where truth really does set you free. Stop trying to be perfect. God doesn't expect it. It says he's not standing up in heaven with a heavenly sledgehammer waiting for you to screw up. The gift of grace means that you can be forgiven for anything, and the shame is gone. Have you ever been in a spot where you're actually just really in a good place with the Lord, and you're having your quiet time, and that's going really good, and God's speaking to you regularly, and prayers are being answered, and all is really, really good, and then you find yourself in a situation, and I'm going to apologize to Abby because I wrote this down before this happened to you yesterday, where you find yourself in a situation where somebody blows a stop sign and almost T-bones you, and you're looking at this person and go, oh, God bless them. They must be in a hurry. I wonder what could possibly be wrong. I bet I should just pray for them right now. You ever been in that situation? Me neither. I don't live there. I get super, super critical about stuff like that. Sometimes I have pieces of that in my life where I don't automatically jump to negative conclusions about people. And that's where, as a believer, I'm expected to live. Where you're just kind of always thinking about what the Lord would do and what the Lord would have for you, but you just can't do that. You need forgiveness from Jesus daily for the issues and the words and for my thoughts, the things that I deal with. And as a Christian, that forgiveness is always available for the asking. But in this case, the Jewish leaders were only helping to build a case against them. Can you imagine all of the backroom conversations, all of the conniving, all of the planning for how to kill Jesus, how to get him, how to trap him in his words? They thought that they were alone when they said it. They thought nobody was listening. They thought nobody was taking notes on the words that they said, let alone the murder in their hearts. What do you think, the surprise is going to be when they stand before the Lord and have to account for that? Verses 63 and 64, it says, Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, What further need do we have of witnesses? For you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? And they all condemned him to be deserving of death. So this is a pretty dramatic thing, and if you know many Jewish people, they're a very passionate group of people, and so this is basically all for show. This is nothing that really shocked him. It was more of an aha moment than I'm totally offended by this blasphemy. He was probably really relieved. And so what you see here is a show. The tearing of the clothes is a sign of uncontrollable frustration for a moral outrage. But you know what's in these guys' heart all the time. It's melodramatic, it's self-righteous, and it's a show for manipulation only. The Levitical punishment for blasphemy was death. But in this case, if it's true, it's not blasphemy, is it? As a matter of fact, the blasphemy is on the people that are accusing him of not being the Messiah. So the Jews lost the power to basically enact capital punishment under Rome. And Rome would be the final authority. So in researching that, I'm like thinking to myself, well, I mean, there's plenty of cases where that didn't happen. Think about Stephen. Stephen, they didn't go take him before any Roman council. They just stoned him right then and there. How could they get away with that? And so you have to kind of look at the different people we're dealing with. Jesus had a huge following. This guy was very, very well known. If they were to try and sneak him out of town, rain stones on his head, people would have a fit. The only way to get rid of Jesus is to trick the Romans into doing it for them. So they could stand back and go, it's not us. It wasn't us. We didn't have blood on our hands, when actually they had all of it. Their plot was to make Rome the scapegoat. And we'll actually see more of that next week. Verse 65 says, Then some began to spit on him and blindfold him and beat him and say to him, Prophesy. And the officers struck him with the palms of their hands. So this has always been kind of a vivid picture for me. As a person who has been punched in the face in sport and in training and, every once in a while caught one in the line of duty, it's never fun. And not knowing it's coming is the worst. If you're able to kind of brace yourself and maybe absorb it, or you even just know where it's coming from, I mean, it's still bad. But, I mean, it's those sucker punches that really, really are the worst. And to be blindfolded and then hit and asked to prophesy. The creator of the universe, prophesy. Which one of us hit you? I mean, the amount of restraint that Jesus had, oh my goodness, it just blows my mind how he was able to not need to dispense justice immediately. It blows my doors off, and it's humbling too. And I guess it's humbling because for me it would you would get mad and you would get ticked off, but it would be a pride thing. How dare you? How dare you do this to me? So it wouldn't be that I was outraged, at a wrong in general. It was a wrong done to me. And so any reaction negatively like that would be all about me. And that's where you see Jesus. He wasn't like that. He didn't take matters into his own hands because he was not prideful, like I am. Verses 66 through 68 says, "Now Peter was below in the courtyard, and one of the servant girls of the high priest came, and when she saw Peter warming himself, she looked at him and said, 'You also were with Jesus of Nazareth.' But he denied it, saying, 'I neither know nor understand what you are saying.' And he went on to the porch, and the rooster crowed." So now we come back to our friend Peter. This is happening. This is not happening right while they're beating Jesus. This is happening, right back to the beginning of the portion of Scripture, where he has followed Jesus up till this point. They're at the high priest Annas' house, and he is kind of in the background, waiting to see what happens. So this is basically the story from Peter's perspective. Remember, the book of Mark. Mark was a protege of Peter, and so I'm always very interested in what Peter has to say about himself when he has situations like this. This is Peter's biggest failure that's recorded, and so it's interesting to see how Peter deals with his own failure. One of the most debated issues with Mark's version of this event starts back in verse 30. If you want to just look up back over to verse 30, it says, "Jesus said to him, 'Assuredly, I say to you that today, even this night before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. Mark's gospel is the only account that mentions the rooster crowing twice. All the others say it just once. So a lot of people will take this as a biblical contradiction, and they'll point to that as they say it's all fake. One says 2 crows, one says 1 crow. Ha! Gotcha. And when you do that, you have to look at what actually makes a contradiction. And so, just as an example, if I say in my gospel, the Gospel of Dan, that this certain thing is going to happen, and then Rob comes up and Rob says in the Gospel of Rob, this specific thing will not happen, that's a contradiction. Okay? And then we know when it happens that, Rob's gospel is false and he's a heretic, and we stone him. That is the definition of a contradiction. The other gospels don't say that there will be one and only one crow of the rooster before Peter's denial. They just say the rooster's going to crow, and then all the accounts end pretty much in the exact same way. So there's all sorts of speculation on the crowing of the rooster as more of a they would divide up the evening into 4 watches. If you were standing guard, you would have 4 different watches. The first watch was the evening. The second watch was the midnight watch, and that's from like 9 to midnight. And then the third watch was actually called the crowing of the cock, and that was between 12 and 3. And then the morning watch was 3 to 6. So, there's all sorts of people that try and do backflips to make this not a contradiction, when all you really have to look at is, just because the other Gospels didn't say that there was 2 doesn't mean that Mark is wrong. It means that Mark has more detail in his account than the other Gospels do. And again, knowing that it's Peter's story, that makes a lot of sense. So when we go back to back to Peter again, the first and second account of his denial here are at the home of Annas, and it's at least an hour before going to Caiaphas' house. And so in your Bibles, if you would take between the verses 54 and 55, just write a little line right through there, and off to the side write John 18, 19 through 24. So basically that is the very small part where it talks about Mark being at Annas' house, Jesus being at Annas' house, And then Peter's denial is a much greater part of that story. Not much happened, at Annas' house with Jesus, but a lot happened with Peter. So that's where we pick it up. And from 55 on is the account of the trial at Caiaphas' house. And that's when the third denial actually happens. So in verse 69 and 70 it says, "And the servant girl saw him again and began to say to those who stood by, 'This is one of them.' But he denied it again." So far we have one denial. Then Peter walks onto the porch, the rooster crows, and then we have the second denial. And then halfway through verse 70 says, "And a little later, those who stood by said to Peter again, 'Surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean, and your speech shows it.' And then he began to curse and swear, 'I do not know this man of whom you speak.'" So apparently Galilean was an accent that was pretty easy to identify at the time. We don't know what it, I have a feeling it sounds, probably Southern. Pretty easy to pick up on people that are from Mississippi and Georgia. If you're in this part of the country, they kind of stand out. Their speech identifies them. And that's basically what was going on here. And just to prove to these people that he was not a follower of Jesus, he starts to swear and curse to prove he's not a Christian. Think about that for a minute. Is that just crazy? So when I moved, our family moved to Washington from California in 1985. Now, when we hit Washington from Southern California, first of all, Southern California in the 80s was like everything that was cool was from Southern California, except me. But we hit Washington State, and I seriously, I talked just like I stepped out of the movie set of Fast Times at Ridgemont High. So I was like, "Totally bogus, check it out, dude." Yeah, and that was Valley speak, and it's hard to imagine now. Maybe it isn't. But I talked like that, but I didn't swear like they did, but I had kind of the lingo. I was raised in a Christian home, so it's not that I was, I'd never heard swearing, but it just never really happened in our house. And so when we moved here, I was in 8th grade, and, I talked like some cool California kid, but, very quickly they figured out how cool I wasn't. And because I didn't swear, people made all sorts of assumptions about, well, you must be one of them Christian kids. And it was my first year in public school, so we went to a private school before that. So it was an interesting time in my life. I did not fit in very well. And so I remember one time, and all the I don't know if you guys have the same experiences, but it seemed like all the negative interactions I had with other guys always kind of happened around gym class. And I don't know if that's just like the budding testosterone of an 8th grade boy that wants to, challenge all the other ones for dominance. I don't know what it is, but, I remember getting into a kind of a confrontation with another guy who called me a Bible thumper. And I had no idea what that was. I'd never even heard that term. But I kind of got the picture, and he kind of just kept at me with it, and so to prove that I wasn't, I looked at him and I said, "You know what? I'm no effing Bible thumper." Yeah. And because my swearing apparently lacked the conviction of somebody who is used to that kind of language, it didn't fool anybody, And I think about that was the first time I really felt like I was lukewarm. And, I kind of, as I see Peter going through this, I'm like, I know what that feels like. Well, I know what it feels like on a very small scale, because it's not like I wasn't looking across the courtyard at my Savior while I was doing it. I was in the locker room at Park Middle School, trying to just survive. But it was a horrible thing, and it's one of those things where he's like, I can't believe that actually came out of my mouth. And I was horrified. Verse 72 says, a second time the rooster crowed, and Peter called to mind the word that Jesus had said to him. Before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. And then he thought about it and he wept. So when the rooster crowed the first time, Peter wasn't thinking about what Jesus had told him. It's just background noise. Now, we live where we have lots of chickens, and believe me, they just don't ever stop crowing. If you've been around chickens, they just, I mean, you get this picture. I don't know, we just watched that old movie Babe, about the little pig, a couple weeks ago with our grandkids. And it's funny, the rooster comes out at the exact right time, it's time for me to go out and crow and wake everybody. That is not how that works at all. You can hear them going off, for hours, multiple times. They just never really quit. For the first 3 hours that they're awake, they just won't stop. So the first time this rooster crows, Peter's not really thinking about what Jesus told him. But when he hears the rooster crow right after swearing to prove that he is not a disciple, light bulb. Oh my gosh, what did I just do? So how did Peter find himself in this predicament? It actually starts back in verse 29. So you want to go back to that one real quick. It says, Peter said to him, even if all are made to stumble, yet I will not be. And Jesus said to him, assuredly I say to you that today, even tonight, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. But he spoke more vehemently, if I have to die with you, I will not deny you. That's where this all started. It started with Peter's pride. He's going to be the man. He's going to be the one out of the 12 that doesn't abandon Jesus. Peter really thought he was strong enough. He had the willpower, and that power, as we talked about last week, that willpower that Peter possessed in his own strength was on full display when Jesus was arrested. In verse 47, it says, one of those who stood by drew a sword and struck the servant's high priest and cut off his ear. That's Peter's strength right there. And then in verse 54, we see Peter following at a distance. If you distance yourself from your faith, how can you expect to stand for it? Especially when the pressure's on. As I'm watching that church in California going through what they're going through, I highly doubt those once a month church attendees are going to be at this service. If you distance yourself from your Savior, how are you going to stand when the pressure's on? Next, you see Peter sitting with the servants and warming himself by the fire. So Peter found fellowship and warmth in the company of the ungodly. Having forsaken the fellowship of the fleeing disciples, Peter wanted to seem like just one of the crowd, just one of the lookers on, just wanted to see what was happening. Not a follower of Jesus. And then we have this really interesting part. The officers in Mark chapter 14, verse 65, who struck Jesus are the same people as the servants that he's warming his hands with in verse 54. The same word. We see officers and we see servants, but the same word in Greek is used for both of them. And it's hoparetes, something like that. And it's used for both groups. So Peter found himself sitting and associating himself with the same men who would eventually start slapping Jesus around. Because of Peter's pride and arrogance, Peter ends up in the exact same place he promised he never would. But you know what? It wasn't a surprise to Jesus, was it? Jesus predicted it. It's going to happen, Peter. No, not me. Not me. Not Peter. Not the rock. You know, it's crazy how far he fell in such a short amount of time. We can see the spiritual warfare here. This was Jesus, right before the prediction of Peter's denial. He warns Peter what's in store. In Luke 22:31, it says, "And the Lord said, Simon, Simon, indeed Satan has asked for you that he may sift you like wheat. But I have prayed for you that your faith should not fail. And when you have returned to me, strengthen your brethren." Peter had a rough road back from this failure. And, to his credit, he stayed close with the other disciples. I think he learned a pretty valuable lesson about what his strength got him. And he allowed the failure and grief to inspire a change in him. And what this is really about is, are we willing to take a deep and honest look at our hearts? Every one of us will find that it's dark and terrifying in there. A personal failure of character in every single one of us. We spend so much time crafting our image to other people of the things that we do and the things that we've accomplished and, the things that we possess, and all those things that we think really impress other people. But they're all going to burn. Many would look at the failures of Peter and think, well, there's no going back from that. You might as well just pack it in, maybe change your name, move to another part of the world. You don't want to be associated with that Peter. And a lot of people will do that. They will run away from these failures that they have in their personal life. They'll go and they'll do whatever it takes to start over in another place. And sometimes I believe you do absolutely have to do that. But you see people doing that 4 or 5 times in their lifetime. There's a problem. Peter doesn't do that. There is forgiveness for everybody who calls on the name of the Lord. So, I in a lot of ways, like I said earlier, I can kind of relate to what Peter went through, his failures, and I think as men especially, we can all relate to the whole pride thing and how absolutely ridiculous it is to try and impress each other with, our physical prowess. Especially as you get older, you realize that was worthless. It's like I really don't feel like I have to be the guy picking up, 4 or 5 chairs and moving them when I can make more trips with 2. I don't got to do that anymore. That's what JT's for. That's what Connor's for. They can do all the heavy stuff. Because in the end, it's like what I used to be able to do is not anywhere close to where I'm at now. And my strength and of everything that I had back then wasn't great anyway. But now I know where my strength actually lies. And I want to do this because we do have quite a few people that watch on Facebook, and so, as I was reading through this, I know that a lot of this really spoke to me about how I've lived my life and, the failures that I've had. And maybe you're thinking that you're in the same boat. Maybe you're thinking that this describes you just as much as it does Peter. And the things that you've done, the things that you've said, the things that you've thought, knowing that is being tallied against you in some book somewhere, ready to whip out when the time of judgment comes, that should terrify you. But it's not meant to terrify you. It's meant to drive you towards grace, forgiveness. It's meant to do that. It's not about religion. The Jewish leaders had religion, and look at them. They were the religious elite. They were the ones that tithed out of their spice rack. They were so holy, so concerned with how everybody viewed them. Religion doesn't make you okay with God. It's a relationship. And maybe that doesn't compute because, you think, God must, if he exists at all, he's far off and he's completely uninvolved in this world. I mean, look at it right now. I mean, it's never been more chaotic. It's never been more messed up than it is right now. But then you look a little bit closer at what's going on at that church down in California, with what's going on with the persecution of the church. We're at the tip of the iceberg, folks. A $250 fine for going to church, and we think about that and like, oh, that's really harsh. Well, that would be welcome in China. That would be welcome in Indonesia, in Africa, and other places where Christians live. That's nothing. God is not far off. He is using situations like that to really refine his church, to really point out the difference. I think that anybody, honestly, who reads this story, church versus state, state saying church can't meet, church going, I'm following God, not man, because that's what's right. The U.S. Constitution agrees with me, the Bible agrees with me, and you got some schmuck in a robe telling me, nope, we're going to fine you if you do it. You can't help but look at that and go, you know what? They're standing up for what's right. They're doing the hard stuff. It's like I admire them. Jesus is using situations like that to really, refine us, to get us prepared for what's to come. He's not far off. He's closer than you think. He's not uninvolved. He's not uninvolved in what's going on, and he's not uninvolved with the people that are around you. Jesus is into personal relationships, and he wants one with every one of you. And like I said, since we have a lot of people that watch, throughout the week and stuff like that, and we haven't done this in a while, I want to give this people an opportunity, because I know as a believer, as somebody who's been walking with the Lord for quite some time, I can't help but watch this going on and feeling just the pull of the Spirit as you're reading what's going on with Peter. And I cannot imagine what it must be like living with all the uncertainty of what's going on, not knowing where you're going, not knowing what the future holds. When I look at the chaos in the world, I have a little bit of anxiety because I care about people, because I have family members that could get caught up in things, that could be affected by stuff. But you know what? I have peace about it overall because I know who wins. I know what the end is. And you know what? Every one of us can. It's that peace that I think that especially as you get older in life, you search for. You see all these, millionaires, billionaires, famous movie stars. That's the one thing that all their money can't buy them is peace. And that's what they're searching for. The only one that can really give it to you is Jesus. So, I'd like just to close up. I'm gonna say a prayer, and if you're out there watching us on Facebook or on YouTube, and this is somehow hit you between the eyes, I want you to repeat this after me as we sing it, as we pray. So if everybody here would just kind of bow your heads, I'm going to go ahead and just say this. If you're watching, or if you're in the room, and this is something you want, this is something that you feel that call, you feel that draw of the Spirit. It's like, come home. It's going to be okay. It doesn't need to be hard. You can just say this after me. Here we go. It says, Jesus, I've sinned against you, and I'm sorry. And I ask you to forgive me. I want to live for you. And I want that peace that passes understanding. I want the strength to stand up for you even when it's scary. Thank you for the cross. Thank you for your sacrifice. I give my whole life to you now. Amen. So, if you're watching and that was a prayer that you prayed, if you would just drop us a line, you could Facebook message us, you could send us an email. We'd love to connect with you, encourage you. We can send you a Bible if you don't have one. Whatever we can do to kind of help you on the start of this journey that you've just taken. So we're just going to close out, and we'll see you.